Hello, everybody. We're on to Chapter 5 now, the chapter about the integument, or sometimes known as the integumentary system. My Chapter 5 almost got cut off there, but I think the big, I guess, cube of skin kind of tells it all, tells the whole story there. The integument is made up of the cutaneous membrane, which is what we in layman's terms called skin. That cutaneous membrane has an outer and inner layer. The outer layer is the epidermis, made up of stratified squamous epithelial cells. And in your head, think of everything you know about epithelial cells, or try to remember. And if you don't, I will probably be refreshing your memory in the course of this lecture. And the inner dermis. The dermis is reticular connective tissue with items embedded in it, like the sweat gland, like the oil gland, like the hair follicle. And they are, well, they're not embedded, they're in there, they're in amongst those fibers, and then they have a connection through and many times to the outside of the epidermis. And then you have connective tissue, that hypodermis layer, plus accessory structures. Accessory structures such as hair, nails, and then exocrine glands, sweat glands, and oil glands, which are the multicellular exocrine glands. This picture is an excellent one. It's good for lab, it's good for lecture, but lecture tends to ask some anatomy questions, but mostly physiology type questions. The hypodermis is part of connective tissue, and it is a subcutaneous layer. It is loose connective tissue that lies below the dermis. So those are the key players with regard to the integument. That dermis actually does have a papillary layer and a reticular layer. Two interesting different aspects of that. And then you have your hair follicle as well as the shaft, and the shaft is the portion that we see. A sweat gland that can be the ones that are pervasive and all over the place. I call them eccrine glands. It can also be a sweat gland, an apocrine gland, so you could have two different types depending on where you are in the body. And then you have corpuscles. This is kind of a new word, Meissner's tactile corpuscles. Corpuscles are something that's a little bit more elevated in design than a free nerve ending. So it's a sensory organ that's embedded in the skin for light touch. You can tell because it's very close to the surface of the skin. And it's more, sorry, I had to take a drink of water. It's more designed than a free nerve ending, so it gets a different name called a corpuscle. You see this in the glomerulus too, in the kidney. We call that the glomerular corpuscle. Sebaceous gland, that's one of your exocrine glands, the multicellular. And then a smooth muscle, a rector pili muscle that allows the hair to stand up, allows you to make goosebumps, I guess goosebumps, not goose pimples, and serve in a more primitive reaction to a perceived threat, I guess, by the autonomic nervous system. And then the deeper corpuscles, the laminated, otherwise known as Pacian corpuscles, you can see those a little bit deeper in the dermis, and those are for deeper touch, not like somebody pounding on me deep touch, but say the light touch is more of a little bug walking on me, and the deeper touch is somebody who's putting a little bit of pressure, not deeper pressure. We're not talking about deep pressure here. And then the nerve fiber, and you can see where that's pretty, like I said, in design that's not particularly overly designed. And then your sweat gland. The functions of the integumentary system, protection is the big one, and certainly if I asked you in advance, what is the function of the integumentary system? Protection from all the stuff that's out there in the world, and there's a lot of stuff out there. So all environmental hazards that it can function to do. Now understand there are some environmental hazards that are beyond its control, but as long as it's intact and it is designed to protect you, it's on the job. Storage of lipids, coordination of immune response to pathogens and skin cancers. So, well, many things in the body coordinate for immune response, because you need to be able to fight off a lot of things that are non-self. There are macrophages embedded in the skin. There's dendritic cells. These are all cells that are uniquely suited to coordinate with the immune system. And then, of course, skin cancer starts in the skin. And when you have a mutation, you have a shift in some cells of the skin, that information will be relayed to the immune system, basically to the systemic part of the body, and then the body will start fighting that. Sensory information, it is your largest sense organ. This is information going to the brain. The beginning of vitamin D synthesis. So it actually synthesizes vitamin D3, which is a precursor to what you use as vitamin D for bone production, for calcium absorption, and henceforth bone production. Excretion of wastes, so excretion of organic wastes, salts, extra water, and then thermoregulation. And that's a fancy word for saying is when you're hot, you're going to sweat, and when you're not hot, so think of, I mean, it's hard to think of it now, but it's happening. Every season it happens. We get cold, and what happens is then the blood flow, so this thermal regulation is in coordination with the water that's lost, so the sweat that's lost, but also with where blood is shunted. So the skin has the ability to shunt blood to the surface, and if you shunt blood to the surface, then heat's going to dissipate, be lost into the environment, out of view. Or the other way, if you shunt blood away from the surface, you're actually going to retain your core temperature, and there you have the quick explanation of thermal regulation. Then you have the bottom part of this image, the epidermis. Its job is to protect the dermis. It does become a water resistant. It's not totally watertight. But water resistant, I want to say skin, but then that wouldn't make sense. Water resistant membrane over the dermis, doesn't allow the entry of pathogens, synthesizing of vitamin D and TH receptors. And then it's the dermis that has the two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. This particular layer, the papillary layer, is going to be the layer that nourishes the epidermis, because the epidermis is epithelial cells, which are avascular, and so there's no blood flow to them. That means no nourishment's coming to them. This is the layer that actually supports and nourishes the epidermis. The epidermis is alive or metabolically active or replicating on the layer that's closest to the basement membrane. And so you have a basement membrane here because it's an epithelial membrane, the epidermis, so a basement membrane. Atop that basement membrane you have a layer called the stratum basale, and that's the layer that actually is making new cells of the epidermis. Reticular layer has sensory receptors to detect touch, vibration. This is where your blood vessels are. The accessory structures of the cutaneous membrane, you have hair, and these are hair on your head, your eyebrows, your eyelashes, These are all the way on all parts of the body that you have hair, and what that does is provides touch sensation, protection, not only of the skull, that's what your book says, the skull, but also protection of the eye, a little bit of catching things there in the eye, and also the sensation with regard to one more thing to pick up the potential for something that could be harming you. With the exocrine glands, these are your sweat and your oil. And then your nails protect the tips of your fingers. They also give you some dexterity. Nails give you a little bit more dexterity, the little ends of the nails, but mostly they're there to protect the fingers and the toes. As I said, the outer layer is avascular. It's made of stratified squamous epithelium. The nutrients that needs, and only the stratum basale needs nutrients. So only the layer that's sitting atop the basement membrane that then articulates with that makes a bond or a connection with the dermis is the only layer that is alive. Then you have degrees of not being alive after that, and I'll explain that to you. Diffuse from the capillaries in the dermis. So the capillary bed is in the reticular layer of the dermis. Those nutrients are going to diffuse on up. The skin, I've got to say this, the skin is your biggest organ, certainly your biggest visual organ, covers the entire body, and it covers the body in a way that's unique or best for it. And what I'm trying to say is you have very thin skin over the eye, you have very thick skin on your palms of your hands, and that makes sense. You have 4 layers, and those layers can have multiple four strata would be a better word to say, and those strata can have multiple layers or not. And you can put more layers down in those strata as needed. So thin skin over the eye, you have thin skin, thinner skin, I would say, on the inside of your arm, but thin skin and thick skin. And thick skin and the palms of the hands and soles of the feet. And if you think of this idea of calluses, where on your hands or your feet, if you have calluses, you have actually extra layers. So that's what I was trying to point to with this thick and thin skin in the layers. That actually more is a strata than a layers. And the organization, we kind of gone through this already, where you have the different layers of the epidermis, and if you have, when I say you have thin skin, there's only 4 of them. Thick skin, you have 5 layers of keratinocytes. One of the things that is showing here, which is kind of interesting, is that papillary layer and the reticular layer has these ridges, and these ridges are determined by our genetic makeup, and they happen to be the ridges of thick skin that make up our fingerprints. We have fingerprints that are unique for us, and we also have toe prints that are unique for us. And we don't really talk about the toe prints so much. We talk about more about the fingerprints, but both of them are unique for each individual. And we will pick this up on the next one.